So now in numbers 9 and 10, we want to sort of get to the punchline here. So what we found is that the strength or quality of their opponent is associated with both the size of the crowd, whether or not it was a sellout, and the outcome of the game. And when that happens, that means that variable, strength of opponent or quality of opponent, is confounding. And when we have a confounding variable, we cannot draw a cause and effect conclusion. Okay, so here's one of the main takeaways from this section. Confounding variables prevent drawing cause and effect conclusions. And so they ask us in number 10 to sort of write a summary to somebody who is not familiar with statistics. So we can't conclude that the sellout crowd caused the Thunder to play worse. What happened was they tended to have sellout crowds when they played against stronger opponents, and that's what could have affected the game result. So another big takeaway from this section, and this would be good for all citizens to understand, association does not imply causation. So we have to be really careful. Just because two variables are associated does not mean that one causes the other. And this is something to actually be really careful about in news reports. You know, you hear a lot of times information about association, but that does not mean that one causes the other. Okay, so another thing I wanted to show you are these tables that I made. This is just another way that you could sort of look at the different numbers that we were given throughout this exploration. You can make, these are called two-way tables, and for some students they find it easier to sort of understand what's going on when they put the numbers into tables like this. So one thing I want you to notice is that when we create one of these two-way tables, we tend to put the explanatory variable to create the columns and the response to create the rows. That's typically how we do it. And then notice the way I've set this up here. I'm just going to rewrite this so it's more clear. The very first thing we were asked was to find the proportion of wins, whether depending on whether they had a sellout, or I put NSO for a non-sellout crowd. And so we can create the 3 out of 18 and the 12 out of 23 that we did, I think it was in number 3. And when those percentages come out different, 0.167 versus 0.522, then we say that crowd size is associated with the game result because the proportions are different. Then in the next one, we compared their proportion of sellout crowds against strong versus weak opponents, right? So in that instance, we could think about opponent quality as the explanatory, or the crowd size, whether they played a sellout crowd, depending on the strength of their opponents. So the crowd size being the response or the dependent there. And so these are the proportions we created, I think, in number 7. 13 out of 22 sellouts against strong opponents versus 5 out of 19 sellouts against weak opponents. Again, we look at the fact that those proportions are different, and that tells us that the opponent quality is associated with crowd size. And then, last but not least, I think in number 8, we looked at their proportion of wins against strong versus weak opponents. So again, you could create these tables and then calculate the proportions down the columns. So here we would say the game result, whether they won or lost, depends on whether they played a strong or weak opponent. So the game result would be considered response, and opponent quality the explanatory. And these are, again, the same proportions we computed before, 0.182 versus 0.579. I just wanted to show you how they look in a table. And the fact that those proportions came out different means opponent quality is associated with the game result. So, off to the side, again, this is the kind of conclusion of how we can determine that opponent quality is confounding. We can find an association between opponent quality and crowd size, which was the original explanatory variable. And we can find an association between opponent quality and game result. That was the original response variable. So when we can show that a third variable is associated with the explanatory and the response, then we can say that that third variable is a confounding variable, and that prevents us from drawing a cause and effect conclusion between the explanatory and the response.